"You're in the wrong line, boys. Economy is back there." That's what Beverly Chen sneered at two men in hoodies pointing a manicured finger toward the back of the plane. She didn't know she was speaking to the owners of the software that kept her airline flying. She didn't know they were twin billionaires who could buy her company with pocket change. And she definitely didn't know that in the next 40 minutes her career would be over, an entire flight crew would be fired, and a single phone call would change the aviation industry forever. This is the story of how two brothers turned a moment of humiliation into a revolution that transformed how we fly. The air inside the private lounge of JFK's Terminal 4 carried the scent of privilege espresso from Italian Machines leather that cost more than most people's cars, and the quiet hum of conversations worth millions. This wasn't just a waiting area. It was a sanctuary for the 1% where hedge fund managers moved markets with whispered phone calls and tech moguls planned their next billion-dollar acquisitions. Standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway, Kai and Zane Washington looked nothing like the typical occupants of this exclusive space. Identical twins at 32, they stood 6'4" with skin the color of rich mahogany and athletic builds that suggested they still remembered their college basketball days. But instead of the crisp Italian suits and Swiss watches worn by the oil executives nursing scotch in the corner booths, the Washington brothers wore vintage streetwear that told a different story entirely. Kai older by exactly 4 minutes and 3 seconds. A fact he never let Zane forget, wore a faded Detroit Pistons hoodie from the 90s, distressed denim that had cost $800, but looked like it came from a thrift shop and limited edition Air Jordans that sneakerheads would kill for. His phone case was cracked, held together with electrical tape, not because he couldn't afford a new one, but because this particular phone had been with him since the early days of building TechFlow Dynamics from his grandmother's basement. Zane dressed almost identically, except his hoodie bore the logo of their old high school in Detroit, and his sneakers were a different colorway of the same exclusive Jordan release. To anyone who didn't read TechCrunch or follow the business pages, they looked like rappers, athletes, or maybe lottery winners who'd stumbled into money and didn't know how to dress the part. But to anyone who paid attention to the forces reshaping American business, they were legends. The twin prodigies who'd revolutionized logistics software and just sold their company for $4.2 billion while retaining controlling interest. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They could afford to buy half the planes on this tarmac, yet they deliberately chose to dress in a way that made people underestimate them. It was their grandmother Ruby's idea, actually, though she'd been gone for 3 years now. Boys, she used to say, stirring grits in her tiny kitchen while they did homework at her wobbly table, let them think you're just another young man in a hoodie. Let them show you who they really are when they think you don't matter. Then you'll know who deserves your business and who deserves your judgment. Ruby Washington had raised them after their father died in a factory accident when they were 8, while their mother, Grace, worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Ruby was the one who taught them to code on an ancient desktop computer she'd bought from a pawn shop, the one who convinced them they could build something bigger than the Detroit neighborhood that seemed determined to swallow young black men whole. She was also the one who taught them that dignity wasn't something you wore like an expensive suit. It was something you carried inside untouchable by other people's ignorance. Kai was deep in thought, finalizing a wire transfer for a real estate acquisition in Zurich on his beaten-up phone when Beverly Chen approached them. At 53, Beverly had the polished look of someone who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of customer service for the wealthy. Her Horizon Air uniform was immaculate. Her silver name tag caught the light just right, and her smile had been practiced in countless mirrors until it looked genuine even when it wasn't. "Excuse me," Beverly said, her voice carrying that specific tone that service workers use when they're trying to sound helpful while simultaneously expressing annoyance. She stepped out from behind the mahogany podium near the lounge entrance, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "This area is reserved for first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members only. The general boarding area is downstairs past the food court." Beverly had worked at this lounge longer than either of the twins had been flying commercially. She knew every face that mattered, every family name that carried weight, every credit card that commanded instant respect. She'd memorized the preferences of oil executives and tech entrepreneurs, pharmaceutical heiresses, and shipping magnates. But she'd never seen these two before, and in her experience, people who belonged in first class looked the part. Kai didn't even glance up from his phone screen where he was reviewing the final details of a merger that would make TechFlow the dominant logistics platform in 3 European countries. We know he set his voice a low rumble that carried traces of Detroit in its cadence. We're flying the 4:15 to London Heathrow first class. Beverly's smile tightened and she adjusted her silk scarf, making sure the Horizon Air logo was prominently displayed. She'd seen this before people who thought they could bluff their way into exclusive areas with confidence and vague answers. "I need to see your boarding passes, gentlemen," she said, extending one manicured hand while keeping her body positioned between them and the rest of the lounge. "We have heightened security protocols today, and I need to verify all passengers personally." It was a lie, and everyone within earshot knew it was a lie. A distinguished gentleman in a charcoal suit reading the Wall Street Journal near the bar shook his head almost imperceptibly, but said nothing. A woman in Chanel whispered something to her companion, and they both turned away, choosing not to get involved in whatever was unfolding. Zane looked up from his own phone where he'd been monitoring TechFlow's stock price up another 3% since yesterday's acquisition announcement and slowly slid his designer sunglasses down his nose. "We already scanned in at the front desk, Beverly," he said, having noted her name tag with the sharp attention to detail that made him a brilliant businessman. The light turned green. "The system confirmed our credentials. We're good to go." "I still need to verify personally." Beverly snapped her professional mask, slipping just slightly. "Company policy for high-value customers. I need to see those boarding passes right now." The phrase high-value customers hung in the air with obvious irony. Beverly was implying that they clearly weren't high-value customers, despite being in a lounge that charged $500 for day passes and required either first-class tickets or elite status that took most people years to achieve. Kai sighed the kind of deep, patient exhale that comes from a lifetime of having his right to exist in certain spaces questioned. He tapped his phone screen and held up the QR code that glowed against the cracked screen protector. "First class seat 2A, he said simply. Zane followed suit, displaying his boarding pass with the same quiet resignation. "First class seat 2B. Beverly stared at the screens as if the digital boarding passes might disappear if she looked hard enough. She blinked repeatedly, looking for some glitch, some Photoshop error, anything that would confirm her assumption that these two men in hoodies couldn't possibly belong in the airline's most exclusive cabin. The names Julian Sterling and Damon Sterling, wait, that wasn't right. The names Kai Washington and Zane Washington stared back at her in official Horizon Air typography, accompanied by confirmation numbers that her system would verify as legitimate. "Fine," she said, finally, her voice carrying the tone of someone who'd been forced to accept a reality she didn't like. She didn't hand the phones back gracefully. Instead, she gestured dismissively toward the buffet area, as if granting permission for them to exist in her domain. "Try not to disturb the other guests. We have several VIP passengers flying today who value discretion and quiet." "We are the VIPs," Zane muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Beverly to hear as they walked past her toward the seating area. "Let it go," Kai whispered, placing a restraining hand on his brother's shoulder. "We've got the consortium meeting in London tomorrow morning. The Zurich expansion, the Berlin partnerships, the whole European rollout depends on this trip. Don't let her rent space in your head when we need to be focused on closing the biggest deal of our lives." They grabbed bottles of imported spring water from the complimentary beverage station and settled into plush leather chairs in the far corner of the lounge away from the cluster of other passengers. This had become their standard operating procedure over the years: find a quiet corner, keep to themselves, and avoid giving anyone a reason to complain about their presence. It was a survival tactic they'd learned early, back when they were scholarship kids at a predominantly white private school where their mother had somehow managed to get them enrolled. They were used to this kind of reception by now. It was the tax they paid for being young, black, and successful in spaces that had been designed for old white money. Usually, the suspicious looks and pointed questions stopped once they flashed their first-class tickets, and people realized they belonged. Usually, the power dynamic shifted quickly once gate agents and flight attendants understood they were dealing with passengers who could buy and sell the airline if they felt like it. But today felt different somehow. Today carried an electric tension that made both brothers slightly more alert than usual. The difference they would soon discover was sitting across the lounge in an overstuffed armchair, growing more agitated by the minute. Harrison Remington III was everything his name suggested: third-generation American aristocracy heir to the Remington steel fortune, and a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. At 58, Harrison carried himself with the particular arrogance that comes from never having been told no about anything that truly mattered to him. Harrison's face was already flushed red from whatever he'd been drinking before arriving at the airport, and his voice carried across the normally quiet lounge like a fire alarm. "I don't care about your computer systems or your booking errors." He was shouting at the trembling desk agent, slamming his Platinum American Express card on the mahogany counter hard enough to make the crystal water glasses jump. "I am a Remington. My family has been flying this route since before you were born, and I demand my usual seat." The poor desk agent, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth, was sweating despite the lounge's perfect climate control. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for any confusion, but seats 2A and 2B were booked 3 weeks ago by the Washington party. The system shows no error in their reservation. They paid full fare, and the seats were assigned according to our standard protocols." Harrison turned his eyes toward the lounge, scanning the space until they landed on Kai and Zane. His gaze lingered on their hoodies, their relaxed posture, their apparent youth, and his face contorted with disgust. He didn't see two of the most successful entrepreneurs of their generation. He didn't see the architects of the software that powered the logistics for half the Fortune 500. He saw exactly what Beverly had seen: two young black men who, in his worldview, couldn't possibly belong in his social stratosphere. Those two, Harrison scoffed the sound wet and ugly, and loud enough to carry across the marble-floored space. "You're telling me that I, Harrison Remington III, am being bumped from my family's traditional seats for a couple of thugs in hoodies who probably used frequent flyer miles, or got some kind of lucky upgrade?" The lounge went dead silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Utensils paused halfway to mouths. Even the soft jazz music seemed to fade into the background as everyone processed what Harrison had just said. In the corner, Kai's finger stopped moving across his phone screen. Zane's water bottle paused halfway to his lips. Both brothers had heard every word clear as a bell, cutting through the refined atmosphere like a serrated knife. Beverly Holloway hurried across the lounge toward Harrison, her demeanor instantly shifting from the suspicious gatekeeper she'd been with the brothers to the fawning servant she became in the presence of recognized wealth. "Mr. Remington," she said, her voice carrying a breathless quality that made it clear she knew exactly who he was and how much his business meant to the airline. "I am so terribly sorry you're experiencing this inconvenience. Is there anything I can do to resolve this situation for you?" "The problem," Patricia Harrison spat, using a name that wasn't hers because he'd never bothered to learn it despite flying this route twice monthly for the past 8 years, "is that airline standards have clearly dropped to accommodate the wrong sort of people. I want seat 2A for myself, and my wife needs 2B. Those seats have been the Remington family seats since 1975. Fix this situation immediately." Beverly looked at Harrison with his custom-tailored suit and his obvious expectation of immediate compliance. then looked across the lounge at the two men in hoodies who'd never caused her any trouble. She did the mathematics of customer service in her head. Harrison Remington flew this exact route to London twice a month for business, returning via the same flight 2 days later. His family had been loyal Horizon Air customers for nearly 5 decades. The airline had probably earned close to $2 million from the Remington family over the years, and Harrison himself was worth keeping happy because he influenced other wealthy passengers in his social circle. The twins, on the other hand, she'd never seen before today. They were probably one-time passengers who'd gotten lucky with an upgrade or used accumulated miles for their tickets, even if they complained about being moved, which they probably would. How much influence could 2 young men in street clothes really have? How much could it possibly matter if she accommodated a known high-value passenger at the expense of 2 unknowns who would disappear back to wherever they came from and never fly with Horizon Air again? "Leave it to me, Mr. Remington," Beverly said, her voice taking on the cold, efficient tone of someone who'd made a decision and was prepared to implement it regardless of who got hurt in the process. "Please go ahead and board the aircraft. I'll handle the seating arrangements once everyone is on the plane. This will be resolved within minutes, and you'll be in your proper seats before takeoff." In their corner of the lounge, Zane's grip on his water bottle tightened until the plastic began to crackle ominously. "Did you just hear what I heard?" he asked, his voice low but carrying an edge that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous. Kai slowly put his phone away, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way they became when he was working very hard to maintain his composure. "I heard every word," he replied, his eyes fixed on Beverly's face across the room. "Every single word." "What do we do?" Zane asked, though he already knew the answer. They'd had this conversation before in different airports, different hotels, different boardrooms where their presence had been questioned despite their obvious credentials. "We get on the plane," Kai said quietly. "We take our seats. We fly to London. And if she tries to implement whatever arrangement she's planning, we document every second of it, and then we teach her exactly who she chose to mess with today." The walk down the jet bridge felt like moving through time itself, each step carrying Kai and Zane Washington deeper into memories they'd spent years trying to outgrow. The industrial carpet beneath their feet and the recycled air flowing through the ventilation system reminded them of countless flights they'd taken as their company grew from a basement startup to a global powerhouse. But more than that, it reminded them of the very first time they'd ever flown first class. That had been 5 years ago when Tech Flow Dynamics landed their breakthrough contract with Amazon's logistics division. They'd bought first-class tickets to celebrate spending more on 2 plane seats than their grandmother Ruby had spent on groceries in 6 months. They'd dressed up that day actual suits from Men's Warehouse dress shoes that they'd practiced walking in because they weren't used to leather soles, ties that they'd watched YouTube videos to learn how to knot properly. They'd thought presentation mattered, that looking the part would earn them the respect that came with paying first-class prices. They'd been wrong. The flight attendant that day, a middle-aged white woman whose name they'd never learned, had checked their boarding passes 3 times, questioned whether they were in the right cabin, and asked if they needed help reading the safety card. When Zane had ordered a glass of wine, she'd asked to see his ID, despite the fact that he was clearly in his late 20s. When Kai had used his laptop during the flight, she'd hovered nearby as if he might be doing something suspicious rather than coding the algorithm that would eventually make them billionaires. That night in their shared hotel room in Seattle, they'd called their grandmother Ruby from the landline phone because their cell phones didn't work reliably yet. She'd listened to their frustration with the patient wisdom of a woman who'd lived through decades of much worse treatment than suspicious glances and repeated ID checks. "Boys." Ruby had said, her voice crackling through the phone connection from 2,000 miles away. "Let me tell you something about dignity that your grandfather taught me when I was younger than you are now. Dignity isn't something you put on like a fancy suit. and it's not something other people can take away from you by being ignorant. Dignity is something you carry inside yourself, and the minute you start dressing to make other people comfortable with your success, you've given them power over who you're allowed to be. That conversation had changed everything. The next time they'd flown, they'd worn exactly what made them comfortable hoodies and jeans and sneakers that told the story of where they came from rather than where they were going. They'd decided to let their actions speak louder than their wardrobes, to let the quality of their work and the size of their bank accounts do the talking while they dressed like the Detroit kids they'd always been at heart. Ruby Washington had been the moral center of their universe from the time they were 8 years old, and their father Marcus had died in an industrial accident at the Ford plant where he'd worked double shifts to support his family. Grace Washington, their mother, had been devastated by the loss, but she'd also been practical in the way that single mothers learn to be when survival depends on immediate action. She'd taken 2 additional jobs to replace Marcus's income, which meant leaving her twin boys with Ruby during the long hours between dawn and midnight when Grace was cleaning office buildings, stocking grocery store shelves, and doing whatever work she could find that paid cash at the end of each day. Ruby's house on Detroit's east side had been tiny, a 2-bedroom bungalow with linoleum floors and wallpaper that was already old when she'd moved in during the 1970s. But it had also been filled with something that money couldn't buy: the absolute certainty that her grandsons were destined for greatness, and the unwavering determination to give them every tool they'd need to achieve it. She'd bought that ancient desktop computer from a pawn shop when the boys were 10, spending money she didn't have because she'd read an article in Jet magazine about how the future belonged to people who understood technology. She'd enrolled them in every free computer class the Detroit Public Library offered, driving them across town in her rusted Buick that broke down twice a month but somehow always got them where they needed to go. More importantly, Ruby had taught them lessons that no computer class could provide. She'd taught them that intelligence was their most powerful weapon, but only if they learned to use it strategically. She'd taught them that other people's expectations were prisons they never had to accept, but that breaking free required patience, planning, and perfect execution. And she'd taught them that the world would consistently underestimate young black men who didn't fit neatly into acceptable categories, which meant they could build their empire while their competitors were still figuring out whether to take them seriously. "The beautiful thing about being underestimated," Ruby used to say while the boys coded at her kitchen table and she cooked dinner on her 2-burner stove, "is that you can accomplish incredible things while other people are looking in the wrong direction. Let them think you're just another couple of kids with a computer. Let them think you're not smart enough, not connected enough, not sophisticated enough to compete with them. And while they're thinking all that, you build something so powerful that by the time they realize what you've done, it's too late for them to stop you." Ruby had been right about everything except one crucial detail. She'd never lived to see just how right she'd been. 3 years ago, just as TechFlow was beginning its final negotiations with the consortium that would eventually buy them out for billions, Ruby had suffered a massive stroke while tending the small garden behind her house. Kai and Zane had been in San Francisco at the time in back-to-back meetings with venture capitalists who were finally beginning to understand the true potential of what they'd built. They'd gotten the call from their mother at 11:30 at night Pacific time. Ruby was gone by the time they could catch a red-eye flight back to Detroit, dying peacefully in a hospital bed surrounded by the neighbors who'd become her chosen family during the decades she'd lived in the same small house. The last words she'd spoken, according to the nurse who'd been with her, were about her grandsons. "Those boys are going to change the world. I just wish I could see them do it." The funeral had been standing room only, filled with people whose lives Ruby had touched through her work as a substitute teacher, her volunteer hours at the community center, and her uncanny ability to see potential in children that everyone else had given up on. Kai and Zane had spoken at the service, telling stories about the woman who'd taught them to dream bigger than their circumstances and work harder than their competition. They'd promised her memory that they would never forget where they came from, and that they'd use their success to create opportunities for other kids who needed someone to believe in their potential. Now, walking down this jet bridge toward what was shaping up to be another confrontation about their right to exist in spaces they could afford. Both brothers felt Ruby's presence as strongly as if she were walking beside them. They could almost hear her voice, steady and sure. "Boys, remember what I taught you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people show you exactly who they are, and then you decide whether they deserve your grace or your judgment." The Boeing 787 Dreamliner that awaited them at the end of the jet bridge represented the pinnacle of modern aviation technology. Its first-class cabin was a masterpiece of luxury design, with seats that converted to fully flat beds, personal entertainment systems with 17-inch screens, and service that was supposed to make passengers feel like royalty from takeoff to landing. Each suite was designed to provide privacy and comfort for passengers who could afford to pay $12,000 for a 7-hour flight across the Atlantic. But as they stepped into the aircraft's pristine interior, all Kai and Zane could think about was the promise they'd made at Ruby's graveside. They'd sworn to her memory that they would never let anyone diminish their worth, but they'd also promised that they would never use their power to hurt people who were simply ignorant rather than malicious. The question they faced now was which category Beverly Chen and Harrison Remington fell into, and what Ruby would have wanted them to do about it. Their seats, 2A and 2B, were located in the very front of the first-class cabin, offering the most privacy and the best service that Horizon Air had to offer. They were also, as it turned out, currently occupied by Harrison Remington and his wife Vivian, who looked like a woman who'd spent her entire marriage trying to pretend she didn't notice her husband's behavior. Harrison was already settled in with a glass of pre-departure champagne. His jacket hung neatly in the suite's wardrobe, his shoes kicked off as if he owned the entire aircraft. Vivian sat rigidly in the seat beside him, clutching a designer handbag and staring out the window as if she could disappear into the tarmac scene beyond. Kai stopped in the aisle and checked his boarding pass once more, though he'd already memorized every detail. He took a deep breath that carried Ruby's voice. "Dignity, baby. Always dignity first." Then he stepped into the suite area and spoke quietly to the man who'd taken his seat. "Excuse me," Kai said, his voice perfectly polite, but carrying an undertone that suggested this was not a conversation he intended to have twice. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." Emma Rodriguez pressed her face against the small window of row 3 and watched the ground crew loading luggage into the belly of the massive aircraft. At 8 years old, she possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that adults often envied, combined with an innocence that allowed her to see situations with startling clarity. This was her first time flying alone, a big adventure that had started when her grandmother in London had gotten sick, and her father, an airline mechanic at JFK, had somehow managed to arrange for his daughter to visit during the school break. Emma's father, Miguel Rodriguez, had worked for various airlines for 15 years, moving from company to company, as layoffs and mergers reshuffled the industry. He'd taught his daughter everything he knew about airplanes, how they flew, why they were safe, and most importantly, how they were supposed to treat every passenger with equal respect, regardless of what they looked like or how much money they had. Mija, he'd told her during the drive to the airport that morning, an airplane is like a little piece of the world flying through the sky. Everyone on board is trusting each other to act right, to be kind, to remember that we're all just people trying to get somewhere we need to be. The unaccompanied minor service had been a revelation for Emma. A nice lady from the airline had given her special badge and a packet of activities, then escorted her to the first-class cabin where her seat was located. The upgrade, the airline representative had explained, was a courtesy for children traveling alone, ensuring they received extra attention from the flight crew and had comfortable accommodations during what could be a stressful experience. Emma had never seen anything like the first-class cabin. Each seat was like a small room with its own television screen, reading lights that adjusted in 17 different ways and more buttons and controls than she could figure out. The flight attendant, a kind woman named Sandra, had shown her how everything worked and brought her a special kids' meal pack with crackers, cheese, and apple juice. Emma felt like she was traveling in a spaceship designed for princesses. From her window seat, she had a perfect view of the boarding process, and she'd been watching with fascination as different types of passengers made their way onto the aircraft. There were business people in suits typing furiously on their phones, families with small children juggling diaper bags and strollers, elderly couples holding hands as they navigated the narrow aisles, and flight attendants moving efficiently through the cabin, checking overhead bins and ensuring everyone was settling in properly. But something had caught Emma's attention that didn't seem right. She'd watched two men in hoodies approach the very front of the first-class cabin, look at their tickets, and then speak quietly to a man who was already sitting in those seats. The man in the seat had looked angry, waving his hands and raising his voice in a way that reminded Emma of her friend's father when he'd had too much beer at backyard barbecues. One of the men in hoodies, the one with kind eyes who reminded her of her favorite teacher, had remained perfectly calm, but she could see tension in his shoulders that suggested he was working very hard to stay polite. Emma had been raised to notice when adults weren't acting the way they were supposed to act. Her father had taught her to recognize the difference between people having a bad day and people being deliberately mean to others. This felt like the second kind of situation, and it made her stomach twist in a way that meant something wasn't fair. She unbuckled her seatbelt and walked forward to where the conversation was happening. The airline had explained that unaccompanied minors were allowed to move around the cabin during boarding, and several crew members had already told her she could come to them if she needed anything at all. What she needed right now was to understand why the kind-eyed man was having to explain something that seemed obvious to her 8-year-old logic. "Excuse me," Emma said, her small voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Are you okay?" The man in the hoodie. Kai looked down and saw a little girl with pigtails wearing a bright yellow dress and the special badge that identified her as an unaccompanied minor. Her dark eyes were wide with concern, and she was holding a small stuffed elephant that was clearly her travel companion. Something about her reminded him instantly of his sister Maya, who died in a car accident when she was 9 years old, 22 years ago. Maya had had that same fearless way of approaching adults when she thought something wasn't right, that same instinct to step into situations where kindness was needed. "We're fine, sweetheart," Kai said, gently crouching down to her eye level. "Just a little confusion about our seats. Nothing for you to worry about." "But you look sad," Emma observed with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "And that man looks angry. My dad says planes are supposed to be happy places where everyone feels welcome." Zane, who had been standing silently beside his brother while they waited for Harrison Remington to respond to their polite request that he move out of their seats, felt something inside his chest tighten. This child's simple observation cut straight to the heart of what was happening here. She'd identified the emotional reality of the situation with more clarity than most adults could manage. "Your dad sounds like a very smart man," Zane said, his voice softening in a way that it rarely did around strangers. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Rodriguez. My dad fixes airplanes, so he knows a lot about flying. He told me that everyone who has a ticket should be able to sit wherever their ticket says, and that crew people should help make that happen, not make it harder." She looked directly at Harrison, who was still sprawled in seat 2A as if he had no intention of moving. "Did you lose your ticket, mister? Because these gentlemen seem to know where they're supposed to sit." Harrison's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. Being questioned by a child about his behavior was not something he'd anticipated, and her innocent directness made his position suddenly seem absurd even to him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his entitlement. "Listen here, little girl. Harrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that some adults used when they wanted children to go away. This is a grown-up situation that you don't understand. These seats belong to people who know how to act appropriately in first class, not to people who dress like they're going to a basketball game. Emma's eyes widened not with fear, but with the kind of shock that comes from hearing an adult say something that conflicts with everything good adults had taught her about how people should treat each other. She looked from Harrison to Kai and Zane, taking in their hoodies, their calm demeanor, their obvious education and politeness. Then she looked back at Harrison with the kind of judgment that only the truly innocent can deliver. "My dad says that clothes don't make people good or bad," Emma said, her voice carrying the authority of someone quoting absolute truth. "He says that how you treat other people is what makes you good or bad. And you're being mean to these nice men for no reason I can see." In that moment, Beverly Chen appeared from the galley, her face flushed with the kind of determination that comes from someone who's made a decision and intends to implement it regardless of who objects. She'd watched the interaction from a distance and decided it was time to execute the plan she'd discussed with Harrison in the lounge. "Mr. Washington! Mr. Washington!" Beverly said, her voice carrying false sweetness that couldn't quite mask her underlying irritation. "I need to speak with you about a slight adjustment to your seating arrangements." Emma looked up at Beverly with the same innocent curiosity she'd shown the brothers. "Are you going to help them find their right seats?" she asked. "Because I think they're already in the right place." Beverly barely glanced at the child. In her experience, unaccompanied minors were potential problems that needed to be managed quickly and efficiently, not sources of wisdom about customer service policy. "This is an adult matter, dear. Why don't you go back to your seat and let us handle this?" But Emma didn't move. Something in Beverly's tone reminded her of the substitute teacher who'd been mean to her friend Carlos last year, the one who'd treated him differently because his family didn't speak English at home. Emma's father had taught her that when she witnessed unfairness, she had two choices. She could look away and let it continue, or she could stand witness and remember everything, so she could tell someone who had the power to make it stop. "I'll go back to my seat," Emma said politely. "But I'm going to remember everything that happens here because my dad says that's how we make sure good people get treated fairly." Kai felt something shift inside his chest as this little girl appointed herself as their witness and protector. Ruby would have loved Emma Rodriguez, would have recognized in her the same fierce sense of justice that had driven Ruby to fight for every child who'd ever been underestimated or ignored. In that moment, Kai realized that this situation had become bigger than just their personal comfort or convenience. They were being watched by someone who represented the next generation, someone who was learning right now about how power and privilege worked in the real world. "Thank you," Emma, Kai said quietly. "Your father raised you right." As Emma walked back to her seat, she passed Sandra, the flight attendant who'd been taking care of her since boarding. Sandra had been working in aviation for 12 years, and she'd seen enough passenger conflicts to recognize when a situation was escalating beyond normal customer service protocols. She'd also been watching the interaction between Beverly and the Washington brothers with growing discomfort. "Is everything okay up here?" Sandra asked, her voice professional but carrying genuine concern. "Everything's fine," Beverly said quickly. "Just handling a seating adjustment. Mr. and Mr. Washington are being moved to more appropriate accommodations that better suit their needs." Sandra's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd seen the brothers' boarding passes when they'd first entered the aircraft, and there had been nothing inappropriate about their seat assignments. More troubling, she'd heard Harrison's comments about basketball games and appropriate behavior, and she recognized the coded language that people used when they wanted to express racial prejudices without using explicitly racial terms. "Ma'am," Sandra said carefully, "if there's been an actual error in the seat assignments, I'd need to see documentation from the gate agent explaining what happened and why these passengers need to be moved. Company policy requires written authorization for any seat changes that affect first-class accommodations." Beverly's jaw tightened. She hadn't expected to have to justify her decision to the cabin crew, and she certainly hadn't prepared documentation to support what was essentially an arbitrary decision to appease Harrison Remington's sense of entitlement. But she'd committed to this course of action, and backing down now would mean admitting that she'd made the decision for reasons that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The authorization is being processed through the gate system, Beverly lied smoothly. I have verbal approval from management to make whatever accommodations are necessary to ensure passenger comfort and safety. Sandra knew a fabrication when she heard one, but she also knew the hierarchy of airline operations. Beverly was a senior gate agent with 15 years of experience and direct authority over boarding procedures. Sandra was a flight attendant whose job was to ensure safety and comfort once the aircraft door closed, not to override decisions made by ground personnel. If she challenged Beverly's authority directly, she could find herself written up for insubordination, which could affect her ability to bid for the international routes that made her job financially worthwhile. But Sandra also knew that she'd be required to write a report about any passenger incident that occurred during boarding, and that report would become part of the airline's official record. If this situation escalated, and her experience told her it was likely to escalate, she wanted to make sure that her documentation reflected exactly what had happened and why. "I understand," Sandra said carefully. "I'll need to note in my report that the seat change was made at the direction of gate personnel for passenger accommodation purposes. Can you provide me with your authorization number for my documentation?" Beverly hesitated for just a moment too long. She didn't have an authorization number because she didn't have actual authorization. What she had was her own judgment about which passengers deserved premium treatment and a willingness to abuse her position to implement that judgment. But she'd gone too far to back down now. "I'll get you that number once we're airborne," Beverly said. "Right now, I need to complete the boarding process and get these passengers settled in their proper seats." From her window seat in row 3, Emma Rodriguez watched the entire interaction with the kind of attention that adults usually reserved for emergency situations. She didn't understand all the words being used, but she understood the emotions perfectly. The kind men in hoodies were being treated unfairly by the woman in the uniform, and the nice flight attendant was trying to help but couldn't because of rules that didn't make sense. Emma made a decision that would have made her father proud. She pulled out the special notebook he'd given her for the trip, a small pink diary with a lock and key where she was supposed to write down everything interesting that happened during her adventure. In her careful second-grade handwriting, she began to document everything she'd witnessed, including the names on the badges of all the adults involved and exact quotes of the meanest things she'd heard. Emma Rodriguez didn't know it yet, but she was about to become the most important witness to a confrontation that would change how airlines operated forever. Beverly Chen stood at the entrance to the first-class galley, her hands shaking slightly as she pretended to review passenger manifests on her tablet, while actually trying to figure out how to implement the promise she'd made to Harrison Remington without creating a scene that would attract unwanted attention from other passengers or crew members. 15 years of customer service experience had taught her how to handle difficult situations with diplomacy and grace. But this wasn't a difficult situation. This was a situation she'd created by making a promise she shouldn't have made to accommodate a passenger's prejudices rather than following established airline protocols. The truth was that Beverly had grown up in rural Michigan, in a town where diversity meant the difference between Methodist and Lutheran churches, where her only exposure to black culture had come through television shows and news reports that emphasized conflict over community. She'd moved to New York for college and never moved back, building a career in the airline industry that had given her a comfortable middle-class lifestyle and the opportunity to travel to destinations she'd never imagined visiting as a child. But she'd also spent those 15 years working primarily with affluent white passengers who treated her with the kind of polite condescension that service workers learn to navigate by anticipating needs and avoiding conflicts. Beverly wasn't malicious in the way that Harrison Remington was malicious. She didn't wake up each morning planning to make life difficult for people who looked different from her. but she'd internalized a worldview that equated expensive clothing with respectability that assumed wealthy white customers were more valuable than unknown passengers, and that prioritized avoiding conflict with established clients over protecting the rights of first-time travelers. In her mind, she was being practical and professional by accommodating Harrison's demands, even if the accommodation required bending rules that existed specifically to prevent this kind of arbitrary treatment. What Beverly hadn't considered was that her practical professionalism was about to collide with forces that operated by entirely different rules. She'd made assumptions about Kai and Zane Washington based on their clothing and their apparent youth, never bothering to research who they were or why they might be flying first class to London on a Tuesday morning. She'd treated them as interchangeable with any other passengers who didn't fit her preconceptions about what wealth and success looked like, never imaging that they might have resources that dwarfed Harrison Remington's steel fortune or connections that reached into the highest levels of the corporate structure she served. Meanwhile, Harrison Remington was experiencing the particular kind of rage that comes from having one's worldview challenged by people who refuse to accept their assigned place in the social hierarchy. He'd built his entire identity around the assumption that his family name and inherited wealth automatically granted him precedence over people he considered inferior, and the quiet dignity with which Kai and Zane had responded to his aggression only made him angrier. In Harrison's experience, people who belonged in first class either deferred to his obvious superiority or engaged with him as equals who recognized his social standing. The Washington brothers had done neither, treating him instead with the kind of polite indifference usually reserved for service workers or children having tantrums. Harrison was also dealing with pressures that had nothing to do with airplane seating, but everything to do with his ability to maintain the lifestyle that defined his sense of self-worth. Remington Steel had been struggling for the past 2 years as international competition and changing manufacturing patterns eroded their market share and profit margins. The quarterly board meeting scheduled for the following week would determine whether Harrison retained his position as executive vice president or was forced into early retirement with a severance package that would require him to dramatically downsize his expectations about his future standard of living. The London trip was supposed to be about securing a partnership with European steel manufacturers that could stabilize Remington Steel's financial position and secure Harrison's continued relevance in the family business that had defined the Remington identity for 4 generations. But Harrison was traveling to those meetings from a position of weakness rather than strength, desperate to close deals that his competitors were approaching from positions of financial security and strategic confidence. His insistence on obtaining seats 2A and 2B wasn't really about legroom or champagne service. It was about maintaining the appearance of dominance and control when he felt neither dominant nor in control of his circumstances. Vivian Remington sat silently in seat 2B, clutching her Hermes handbag and trying to disappear into the leather upholstery, while her husband created a scene that was attracting exactly the kind of attention she'd spent 30 years of marriage trying to avoid. Vivian had grown up in a family that valued discretion above almost everything else, where making a public spectacle was considered the ultimate social sin, regardless of whether the underlying cause might be justified. She'd married Harrison partly because the Remington family reputation had seemed stable and respectable, the kind of established American aristocracy that valued good manners and charitable contributions over flashy displays of wealth or public confrontations. But over the course of their marriage, Vivian had watched Harrison's behavior become increasingly erratic as economic pressures and social changes challenged his assumption that the world owed him deference simply because of his family name. She'd learned to make herself small and quiet during his outbursts, to apologize to service workers when he treated them badly, to change the subject when he said things that revealed prejudices she'd been taught to keep private, even if she harbored them. This airplane incident felt like a culmination of years of embarrassing behavior that was becoming harder to ignore or excuse. Vivian knew that the 2 men Harrison was displacing belonged in first class, not just because they had appropriate tickets, but because they carried themselves with the kind of quiet confidence that actually indicated substantial personal accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. She'd watched them in the lounge, noting their expensive but understated accessories, their focus on what appeared to be serious business communications, their polite interactions with service staff who treated them with genuine respect rather than fearful compliance. Everything about their demeanor suggested they were successful professionals who traveled frequently and expected appropriate treatment because they'd earned it, not because they'd inherited it. But Vivian had also spent 3 decades learning that challenging Harrison's behavior publicly led to private consequences that were worse than the public embarrassment of staying silent. So she sat in her stolen seat and stared out the window, hating herself for her complicity, but unwilling to risk the explosion that would come from confronting her husband in front of strangers. In the back of the first-class cabin, Sandra continued her pre-flight preparations, while keeping one eye on the situation developing in row 2. Her 12 years of flight attendant experience had taught her to recognize the difference between ordinary passenger conflicts that could be resolved through customer service protocols and situations that carried the potential for serious escalation that might require intervention from law enforcement or airline management. This felt like the second category, particularly because Beverly's explanation for the seat change hadn't included any of the standard justifications that would normally support moving first-class passengers against their will. Sandra had also noticed Emma Rodriguez's intense attention to everything happening around the disputed seats. Unaccompanied minors were always Sandra's special responsibility during flights, but Emma seemed unusually mature and observant for an 8-year-old when Sandra had checked on her a few minutes earlier. Emma had been writing furiously in a small notebook, her brow furrowed with concentration as she documented something that clearly seemed important to her. Sandra made a mental note to keep extra attention on Emma throughout the flight, both because unaccompanied minors required additional care and because the child seemed to be processing adult conflicts with a sophistication that suggested she might need someone to talk through what she was witnessing. What none of the humans aboard Flight 415 understood yet was that their personal drama was about to intersect with technological systems that operated according to rules that couldn't be bent by customer service considerations or social hierarchies. Kai Washington's phone contained administrative access codes to TechFlow Dynamics' proprietary logistics software that managed scheduling, crew authorization, and flight plan coordination for major airlines, including Horizon Air. The software had been designed with multiple security protocols specifically to prevent unauthorized access or manipulation, but it also included override capabilities that allowed TechFlow's technical team to provide emergency support when clients experienced system failures that grounded aircraft or endangered passenger safety. The irony that was about to unfold was that Harrison Remington's demand for seats that didn't belong to him had created a situation where the actual owners of the technology that kept his airplane flying were being treated as second-class citizens by employees of the company that depended on their software to operate. The collision between inherited privilege and earned power was about to demonstrate which force was more powerful in a world where technology had shifted traditional balances of influence in directions that older generations hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. Kai and Zane had built their entire company around the principle that logistic systems should treat all participants fairly and transparently, that efficiency and equity weren't competing values, but complementary ones that strengthened each other when implemented correctly. Their grandmother Ruby had taught them that the most sustainable success came from building systems that elevated everyone rather than succeeding by keeping others down, and they'd applied that philosophy to every business decision they'd made since leaving Detroit with college degrees and dreams that seemed impossible to everyone except Ruby herself. But Ruby had also taught them that when people mistook kindness for weakness, when they interpreted patience as powerlessness, sometimes the most compassionate response was to demonstrate exactly how much power they'd been choosing not to exercise. "Boys," she'd said during one of their last conversations before her stroke, There's a difference between being humble and letting people walk all over you. Humility means you don't abuse your power just because you can. But when people abuse their power against you, humility means you stop them from doing it to the next person who might not have the resources to protect themselves. As Beverly Chen approached their row with fake boarding passes that would move them to economy seats they hadn't purchased, both brothers understood that they'd reached Ruby's line in the sand. This wasn't about their personal comfort anymore. It was about whether airline employees could arbitrarily redistribute passengers based on racial assumptions without facing consequences that would prevent them from doing it again. It was about whether the next young black professionals who boarded this airline would face the same assumptions and suffer the same treatment, and whether Emma Rodriguez would grow up in a world where she had to choose between staying silent about injustice or speaking up and being ignored. The storm that was gathering in the first-class cabin of Flight 415 was about to become much bigger than anyone except Kai and Zane Washington could have imagined. The moment Beverly Chen stepped into the aisle beside seats 2A and 2B carrying two freshly printed boarding passes that would relocate Kai and Zane Washington to the back of the aircraft, every person in the first-class cabin could sense that something significant was about to happen. The energy in the space shifted from the usual quiet bustle of passengers settling in for a long flight to the electric tension that precedes confrontations that everyone hopes to avoid but can't help watching when they occur. Beverly's smile was so artificially bright it could have powered the cabin's LED lighting system, and her voice carried the kind of forced cheerfulness that customer service workers used when they were about to deliver news that no reasonable person would want to hear. Mr. Washington. Mr. Washington. She said her pronunciation careful and deliberate as if she were speaking to children who might not understand complex instructions. I need to discuss a slight adjustment to your seating arrangements that I believe will work out much better for everyone involved. Kai looked up from his phone where he'd been reviewing final contract details for the London meeting that could result in TechFlow's expansion into 3 additional European markets. His expression was perfectly calm, but Zane recognized the particular stillness that came over his brother when he was working very hard to maintain his composure in the face of something that challenged both his intelligence and his dignity. It was the same expression Kai had worn during their early investor meetings when venture capitalists had suggested they might be more comfortable with smaller funding rounds, or during the acquisition negotiations when lawyers had questioned their technical credentials despite being the architects of software that their clients' businesses couldn't function without. What kind of adjustment, Kai asked quietly, his voice carrying no emotion beyond polite curiosity, though anyone who knew him well would have recognized the warning signs of a mind that was rapidly calculating multiple response scenarios. Beverly held out the 2 boarding passes like peace offerings, though her body language suggested she expected resistance and was prepared to escalate rather than negotiate. Due to some last-minute equipment changes and passenger accommodation requirements, we've moved you to row 38, which is our premium economy section. You'll have extra legroom priority boarding on your connecting flight and complimentary beverages throughout the journey. Many passengers actually prefer this section because it's quieter and less formal than first class. The explanation was so obviously fabricated that it insulted everyone's intelligence, including Beverly's own. There had been no equipment changes. The aircraft was exactly the same Boeing 787 that had been assigned to this route for the past 6 months. There were no passenger accommodation requirements beyond Harrison Remington's entitled demands, and the suggestion that anyone would prefer premium economy over first-class suites that cost $12,000 each was so absurd that even Beverly seemed uncomfortable delivering it. Zane set down his water bottle with the kind of deliberate control that suggested he was physically restraining himself from responding the way his emotions wanted him to respond. Premium economy, he repeated, his voice flat and emotionless. You're asking us to move from the first-class seats we purchased 3 weeks ago to premium economy because of equipment changes that didn't happen to accommodate passengers who arrived after us and took our seats without permission. I understand this might be disappointing. Beverly continued her script, clearly prepared for objections but not for articulate pushback that highlighted the logical flaws in her position. But Mr. Remington is one of our most valued customers, and we always try to accommodate our frequent flyers when special circumstances arise. I'm sure you can understand that customer loyalty has to be considered in these situations. Emma Rodriguez, who was supposed to be settling into her own seat in row 3 but had been unable to stop watching. The unfolding drama felt something twist in her stomach that her 8-year-old vocabulary couldn't quite name, but that her sense of fairness recognized as fundamentally wrong. Her father had taught her that airlines were supposed to honor the tickets people paid for that moving passengers without their consent, was something that only happened in emergencies or when passengers did something dangerous or inappropriate. These men hadn't done anything wrong that she could see. They'd been polite to everyone they'd shown their tickets when asked, and they'd been sitting quietly until other people started bothering them. From his stolen seat in 2A, Harrison Remington was watching the confrontation with barely concealed satisfaction, swirling his pre-departure champagne, and waiting for Beverly to complete the task he'd essentially commissioned her to perform. In his worldview, this was how problems got solved. You identified the people with real influence and made sure they understood that cooperating with your needs was in everyone's best interests. The 2 young men in hoodies clearly didn't understand the social dynamics at play here, and Beverly was doing them a favor by explaining the situation in terms they could accept without losing too much face. Customer loyalty. Kai repeated slowly, as if tasting the phrase and finding it bitter. He stood up from his seat, his 6'4" frame unfolding with the kind of controlled grace that suggested both physical strength and emotional discipline. Ms. Chen, can you explain to me how customer loyalty works when you're asking customers who purchased first-class tickets to give up their seats to accommodate customers who didn't purchase those seats? Beverly's smile faltered for the first time since she'd approached their row. She'd expected compliance or angry objections that she could characterize as disruptive behavior, not logical questions that highlighted the contradictions in her position. Mr. Washington, I really need you to take these new boarding passes and move to your assigned seats so we can complete the boarding process. Other passengers are waiting to get settled, and we need to maintain our departure schedule. Other passengers, Zane said, standing up beside his brother so that they presented a united front that suddenly seemed much more formidable than Beverly had anticipated. You mean the other first-class passengers who are watching you relocate, paying customers to accommodate someone who's throwing a tantrum? Those other passengers? For the first time since this confrontation began, Beverly seemed to realize that her actions were being observed and judged by people beyond just the Washington brothers and Harrison Remington. The first-class cabin contained 12 suites, which meant there were potentially 20 other passengers witnessing her decision to move 2 black men out of their purchased seats to satisfy one white man's sense of entitlement. Several of those passengers were already filming discreetly with their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become a viral social media moment within hours of landing. Sandra, the flight attendant, who'd been trying to maintain her professional obligations while documenting what appeared to be a discriminatory incident, approached the group with the kind of determined diplomacy that came from 12 years of managing passenger conflicts without letting them escalate into situations that would require law enforcement intervention. "Excuse me," Sandra said, her voice professional but carrying an edge that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with what she was witnessing. "Is there a problem with these passengers' original seat assignments? Because I have them documented as being confirmed in 2A and 2B when they boarded, and I wasn't notified of any legitimate reasons for seat changes." Beverly turned toward Sandra with the kind of hostile authority that supervisors use when subordinates question their decisions in front of customers. "This is a gate-level decision, Sandra. I have authorization to make whatever seating adjustments are necessary for passenger comfort and safety. These passengers are being moved to premium economy, and I need you to escort them to their new seats so we can complete boarding procedures. Authorization from whom? Sandra asked her question, cutting through Beverly's bluster with the precision of someone who understood airline hierarchy and knew that gate agents couldn't arbitrarily override confirmed first-class reservations without documentation that would protect both the passengers and the crew from later complaints or legal action. The question hung in the air like a challenge that Beverly hadn't expected and wasn't prepared to answer honestly. She didn't have authorization from anyone except her own prejudices and Harrison Remington's demands. She'd made a customer service decision based on her assumptions about which passengers were more valuable to the airline's business, and now she was being asked to provide documentation that didn't exist because the decision couldn't withstand official scrutiny. I have verbal authorization from management. Beverly lied, her voice taking on the sharp edge that people used when they were committed to a course of action that they couldn't rationally defend. And if these passengers don't comply with the new seating arrangements immediately, I'll have to classify this as a security situation that requires intervention from the captain and possibly law enforcement. The threat was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. Emma Rodriguez, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing distress, suddenly understood that the nice men who'd been kind to her were being threatened with arrest for trying to sit in seats they'd paid for. Her father had taught her that police were supposed to protect people who were being treated unfairly, not arrest people for standing up for their rights, and the disconnect between what she'd been taught and what she was witnessing made her feel sick to her stomach. You're going to call the police on them? Emma asked, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with the kind of moral clarity that made everyone suddenly aware of how their behavior would sound when explained to a child. For trying to sit in their own seats, Harrison Remington, who had been enjoying watching Beverly implement his demands, suddenly felt less comfortable with the situation when it was framed by a child's innocent perspective. "Listen, little girl," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that adults used when they wanted children to stop asking inconvenient questions. "This is a complicated grown-up situation that involves business relationships and airline policies that you don't understand." But Emma Rodriguez understood more than Harrison gave her credit for. She'd grown up around airports and aircraft, listening to her father explain how airlines were supposed to work and why treating passengers fairly was both a legal requirement and a moral obligation. She'd also inherited her father's sense of justice and her grandmother's fearlessness when it came to speaking truth to power, regardless of the consequences. "I understand that those men paid for their seats, and you're sitting in them," Emma said, her voice carrying the devastating honesty that only children could deliver without malice. "And I understand that the lady with the badge is threatening to have them arrested for wanting what they paid for. My dad says that's called stealing, and that people who work for airlines aren't supposed to help passengers steal from each other." The cabin fell into the kind of silence that occurs when someone says something so accurate and so damaging that no one knows how to respond without making the situation worse. Beverly's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. Harrison looked like he'd been slapped by someone he couldn't retaliate against, and every passenger within earshot was now paying complete attention to a confrontation that had been redefined by a child's moral clarity. Kai and Zane exchanged the kind of look that identical twins share when they realize they've reached a decision point that will define not just their immediate circumstances, but their long-term relationship with principles they'd inherited from their grandmother. Ruby had taught them that dignity meant never accepting mistreatment simply because fighting back might be inconvenient or uncomfortable. She'd also taught them that sometimes the most powerful thing they could do was let people fully reveal their character before deciding how to respond. "Mrs. Chen," Kai said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made everyone realize they were dealing with someone who possessed resources they hadn't anticipated. "You've just threatened to have us arrested for refusing to give up seats we legally purchased to accommodate a passenger who has no legal claim to those seats. You've done this in front of multiple witnesses, including a child who clearly understands right from wrong better than you do. Are you absolutely certain this is the course of action you want to commit to? Beverly looked at Kai's face, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she saw something that made her realize she might have made a serious miscalculation. The man standing in front of her didn't look like someone who would be intimidated by threats or confused by bureaucratic double talk. He looked like someone who was giving her one last opportunity to reconsider before implementing consequences that she couldn't imagine and wouldn't be able to control. But Beverly had gone too far to back down now without losing face in front of passengers and crew who would remember her retreat as evidence of weakness rather than wisdom. She'd committed to a course of action based on assumptions that were proving incorrect, but admitting error at this point would require acknowledging that she'd made her decision for reasons that couldn't withstand public scrutiny. Mr. Washington, I need you and your brother to take these boarding passes and move to your assigned seats immediately, or I will be forced to call security and have you removed from this aircraft for disruptive behavior and failure to comply with crew instructions. In that moment, Kai Washington understood exactly what his grandmother had meant when she'd told him that sometimes people needed to face the full consequences of their choices before they could learn to make better ones. The walk from row 2 to row 38 felt like a journey through time itself, each step carrying Kai and Zane Washington deeper into a humiliation that echoed every moment of discrimination they'd faced since childhood, but magnified by the public nature of their defeat and the knowledge that hundreds of passengers were witnessing their forced relocation from the luxury they'd purchased to the economy they'd been assigned by someone else's prejudices. The first-class cabin that they were being expelled from represented more than just comfortable seating and premium service. It represented validation that their success was real, that their grandmother's faith in their potential had been justified, and that they'd earned the right to exist in spaces that had once been closed to people who looked like them. Every step backward felt like surrendering ground that their entire family had fought to claim, like accepting that other people still had the power to determine their worth, regardless of their achievements or their ability to pay for whatever treatment they desired. But perhaps most painfully, their forced march to the back of the plane was being observed by Emma Rodriguez, who sat in her row 3 seat, with tears in her eyes as she watched the kind men who'd been nice to her being punished for something she couldn't understand. Emma's 8-year-old sense of justice couldn't comprehend why the airline lady with the badge was being mean to people who'd been polite to everyone, why the angry man was allowed to keep seats that didn't belong to him, or why no one with authority was stepping in to fix something that was so obviously wrong. "This isn't fair," Emma whispered to Sandra as the flight attendant passed her seat, her young voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that cut through adult rationalizations and exposed the simple truth that everyone was working hard to avoid acknowledging. They were sitting in their own seats. They showed their tickets. They didn't do anything bad. Why is that lady being so mean to them? Sandra paused beside Emma's seat, her own moral compass spinning as she tried to balance her professional obligations with her personal recognition that she was witnessing something that violated both airline policy and basic human decency. She'd seen Beverly's fabricated authorization, heard the made-up explanations about equipment changes that didn't exist, and watched 2 paying customers being relocated to satisfy one passenger's tantrum. But she'd also been trained to support management decisions even when she disagreed with them, and challenging Beverly's authority in front of passengers could result in disciplinary action that might cost Sandra her job. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't seem fair, Sandra said carefully, hating herself for offering platitudes to a child who deserved honest answers, but knowing that she couldn't provide honest answers without jeopardizing her own position. "But I promise I'll make sure everyone is taken care of during the flight." Emma looked at Sandra with the kind of disappointment that children reserve for adults who fail to live up to the standards of justice and courage that children naturally expect from people who are supposed to know better. "My dad says that when something isn't fair, good people are supposed to try to fix it, not just take care of people afterward. The observation hit Sandra like a physical blow because it highlighted the moral compromise she was making in the name of professional prudence. Emma was right. Good people were supposed to try to fix injustice when they witnessed it, not just provide comfort to the victims after the damage was done. But Sandra also knew that airline hierarchies punished employees who challenged authority more harshly than they punished employees who allowed unfairness to continue, and she had a mortgage and student loans that depended on her keeping this job. As Kai and Zane continued their forced march toward economy class, passing row after row of business travelers and tourists who were pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a viral moment. Both brothers felt the weight of every ancestor who'd been forced to accept humiliation in order to survive, every relative who'd swallowed their pride to keep their jobs, every member of their community who'd learned to make themselves small to avoid confrontation with people who held arbitrary power over their circumstances. Row 15, row 20, row 25. Each number felt like a countdown to capitulation, a measurement of how far they'd fallen from the success they'd worked their entire lives to achieve. The premium economy section that Beverly had described as an upgrade was actually a downgrade in every conceivable way. Narrower seats, less legroom, no personal service, and the kind of generic airline food that bore no resemblance to the gourmet meals served in first class. More importantly, it was a public declaration that their money wasn't as valuable as Harrison Remington's sense of entitlement, that their business wasn't as important as maintaining the comfort of passengers who felt threatened by their presence in spaces traditionally reserved for white wealth. Row 30, row 35. The economy cabin was already warm from body heat and recycling air circulation, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of first class. A baby in row 31 was crying with the particular intensity that came from discomfort and overstimulation, adding an audio backdrop to their humiliation that seemed designed to emphasize just how far they'd fallen from the quiet luxury they'd been forced to abandon. Finally, they reached row 38, the premium economy seats that Beverly had promised would be an acceptable substitute for the first-class accommodations they'd purchased. The seats were indeed larger than regular economy, but they were still cramped by any reasonable standard, with armrests that couldn't be moved and tray tables that wobbled when touched. For two men who stood 6'4" and were accustomed to traveling in comfort that matched their financial success, the physical discomfort was immediate and obvious. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of watching other passengers file past them toward their original seats, taking pictures and whispering observations that carried clearly through the aircraft's acoustics. "Can you believe they just moved those guys to the back? I heard the old white guy threw a fit until they gave him their seats. This is going to be all over social media in about 10 minutes. Zane buckled his seatbelt with movements that were carefully controlled to avoid betraying the rage that was building inside him like pressure in a boiler that was approaching dangerous levels. $12,000, he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft's environmental systems. We paid $12,000 each for first-class tickets, and we're sitting in seats that are worth maybe $400, because some racist flight attendant decided we don't look like we belong in first class." Kai pulled out his phone not to make a call or send a message, but to access an application that looked like nothing more than a simple black screen with a blinking cursor. To anyone watching, it would appear that he was opening a basic text editor, or perhaps a simple game to distract himself from their situation. But what Kai was actually accessing was Administrative Control Panel for TechFlow Dynamics Logistics Management System, the proprietary software that managed crew scheduling, flight authorization, and aircraft systems coordination for major airlines, including Horizon Air. The irony of their situation was about to become apparent in ways that Beverly Chen and Harrison Remington couldn't possibly have anticipated. The two men they dismissed as insignificant passengers whose rights could be violated without consequence were actually the architects and owners of the technology that kept their aircraft flying safely and efficiently. The software that managed everything from crew certification to flight plan authorization to passenger manifest verification was controlled by the same people who were now being treated like second-class citizens in the airplane that depended on their technology to operate. "What are you doing?" Zane asked, recognizing the concentration on his brother's face that appeared when Kai was solving complex technical problems that required both analytical precision and creative thinking. "I'm running a diagnostic on the aircraft's systems," Kai replied, his fingers moving across the screen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd written thousands of lines of code that controlled billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. "It seems there might be some issues with the crew authorization protocols that could affect the aircraft's ability to receive clearance for departure." Issues, Zane asked, though he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of issues his brother might be able to create using administrative access codes that gave them control over the very systems that Beverly and her colleagues depended on to do their jobs. "Well," Kai said, his voice taking on the calm, analytical tone he used when explaining complex technical concepts to investors or board members. "The system is designed to verify that all crew members are properly certified and authorized to operate the aircraft according to federal aviation regulations. If the system detects any irregularities in crew status or passenger manifest information, it automatically implements security protocols that prevent the aircraft from departing until the issues are resolved by qualified personnel." Zane felt something that might have been a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth for the first time since Beverly had approached them with her fabricated boarding passes. And what kind of irregularities might the system detect? "Oh, all kinds of things," Kai replied, his fingers continuing to move across the screen as he accessed deeper levels of the aircraft's operational software. "Unauthorized personnel operating outside their certified authority. Passenger manifest discrepancies that suggest security breaches. Crew members making decisions that violate federal regulations regarding passenger treatment and non-discrimination policies." The system is quite sophisticated in its ability to identify situations that require intervention from management or law enforcement. As Kai spoke, he was implementing a series of code modifications that would effectively lock the aircraft's systems until proper authorization could be verified through channels that he controlled completely. The beauty of the solution was that it would appear to be a routine technical malfunction rather than deliberate intervention, and resolving the malfunction would require Beverly and her supervisors to explain exactly why passenger manifest changes had been made without proper documentation or authorization. "How long will it take?" Zane asked. "About 3 minutes for the initial lockdown to engage," Kai replied. "Then, however long it takes for them to realize that the problem can't be fixed by their technical staff and that they're going to need to contact someone with administrative access to override the security protocols." "And who has administrative access?" Kai looked up from his phone for the first time since they'd been seated in their downgraded accommodations, and his expression carried the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from realizing that they weren't victims of this situation, they were architects of whatever happened next. "We do." The first sign that something was wrong came 3 minutes after scheduled pushback time, when the Boeing 787's twin engines, which should have been spooling up to the distinctive whine that signaled imminent departure, remained silent and still. Captain Robert Hayes, a 22-year veteran of commercial aviation who'd never encountered a systems failure he couldn't diagnose and resolve, stared at his flight management display with the kind of confusion that came from seeing error messages that didn't correspond to any malfunction scenarios he'd been trained to handle. "What the hell is this?" Captain Hayes muttered, tapping the screen that should have been showing routine pre-departure checklists but was instead displaying a red warning banner that read, "Crew authorization invalid. Departure clearance suspended pending verification." "Tommy, are you seeing this on your displays?" First Officer Thomas Chen, No relation to Beverly, despite sharing a surname, leaned over his own control panel, which was showing identical error messages accompanied by system alerts that suggested the aircraft's central computer had lost communication with ground-based authorization servers. "I'm showing the same error, Captain. Says our crew certifications can't be verified through the airline's database and the flight plan has been automatically suspended until we can provide manual override codes." "That's impossible," Captain Hayes replied, his voice carrying the kind of professional irritation that came from dealing with technology that was supposed to make flying safer, but occasionally created problems that didn't exist in the era of purely mechanical aircraft. "We both scanned in this morning, the system confirmed our credentials, and we've been flying together for 3 years. There's no reason for the authorization database to suddenly decide we don't exist." What Captain Hayes and his first officer didn't understand was that their aircraft's systems were controlled by software that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of arbitrary decision-making that Beverly Chen had just implemented in the first-class cabin. TechFlow Dynamics had built multiple safeguards into their logistics management platform, specifically to ensure that passenger manifests couldn't be altered without proper documentation, that crew members couldn't override federal regulations without authorization from qualified supervisors, and that aircraft couldn't depart if there were unresolved discrepancies between filed flight plans and actual passenger accommodations. The system that was now preventing Flight 415 from departing wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating exactly as designed, identifying a situation where airline personnel had violated their own policies and federal regulations by forcibly relocating passengers for reasons that couldn't be documented or justified through official channels. Beverly's decision to move Kai and Zane Washington from their purchased seats to economy accommodations without proper authorization had triggered automated security protocols that were designed to prevent discriminatory treatment and ensure passenger safety. In the first-class cabin, Beverly Chen was beginning to experience the kind of professional panic that came from realizing that a routine customer service decision had somehow created a technical crisis that she didn't understand and couldn't control. The aircraft should have pushed back from the gate 15 minutes ago, but instead they were sitting motionless while the captain communicated with ground control about system failures that no one seemed able to explain or resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes." The intercom announcement crackled through the cabin speakers, carrying the kind of carefully controlled frustration that pilots used when they were dealing with problems that threatened to disrupt their schedules and their passengers' travel plans. "We're experiencing an unusual computer malfunction that's affecting our ability to communicate with our dispatch and authorization systems. We're working with ground personnel to resolve the issue, but we're going to experience a delay while our technical team diagnoses the problem." Harrison Remington, who was supposed to be enjoying his victory champagne in seat 2, while the aircraft carried him toward important business meetings in London, instead found himself growing increasingly agitated as the delay stretched from minutes into what was clearly going to be a significant disruption to his schedule. "This is completely unacceptable," he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the kind of entitled indignation that came from someone who'd never learned to accept that some situations couldn't be resolved through complaints and demands. "I have dinner reservations at Claridge's tonight, and I'm not going to miss them because of some computer glitch that should have been prevented by proper maintenance." Vivian Remington continued to stare out the window, watching ground crew personnel begin to gather around the aircraft with the kind of focused attention that suggested this wasn't a routine technical issue that could be resolved quickly. She'd noticed that several passengers in the first-class cabin were openly filming the situation with their phones, and she had a growing sense that her husband's behavior during boarding was about to become part of a story that would extend far beyond their personal travel inconvenience. In row 38, Kai Washington was monitoring the aircraft's systems through his administrative access panel, watching automated security protocols engage according to schedules he'd programmed years earlier when TechFlow first designed the passenger safety and anti-discrimination algorithms that were now protecting travelers from exactly the kind of treatment he and Zane had just experienced. The crew authorization lockdown is fully engaged. Kai reported to his brother, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. The aircraft's central computer is refusing to accept departure clearance because the passenger manifest shows unauthorized changes that weren't approved through proper channels. Every time they try to override the system manually, it's going to ask for documentation that Beverly doesn't have because she made her decision based on prejudice rather than policy. "How long can you keep them grounded?" Zane asked, though he was beginning to understand that his brother's capabilities in this situation extended far beyond simple delay tactics. "As long as necessary," Kai replied. "The system is designed to prioritize passenger safety and regulatory compliance over operational efficiency. If airline personnel violate federal anti-discrimination regulations or company policies regarding passenger treatment, the software automatically implements protective protocols that can only be overridden by people with administrative access to the core systems. And we have administrative access. We have more than administrative access," Kai corrected. "We built the system. Every algorithm, every security protocol, every override capability was designed by our team, according to specifications that we developed based on our understanding of how airlines should treat passengers fairly and transparently. Beverly just discovered that discriminating against passengers isn't just morally wrong, it's technologically impossible when the aircraft's systems are controlled by people who've been discriminated against." 20 minutes into what was supposed to be a routine departure process, Captain Hayes was beginning to understand that he was dealing with a problem that extended beyond normal technical malfunctions. His communications with ground control had revealed that the aircraft systems were functioning perfectly from a mechanical perspective, but that software protocols were preventing departure for reasons that no one in the airline's technical support department seemed able to explain or resolve. "Ground control, this is Horizon 415. Captain Hayes spoke into his radio, his voice carrying the kind of professional concern that suggested he was running out of conventional solutions to an unconventional problem. "We're showing green lights on all mechanical systems, but our flight management computer is refusing to accept departure clearance. It's asking for manual override codes that our operations center says don't exist in their system. We may need to return to the gate and swap aircraft if this can't be resolved quickly." The suggestion of returning to the gate and transferring passengers to a different aircraft sent ripples of alarm through both the cabin crew and the passengers, who could hear the captain's radio communications through the aircraft's intercom system. Aircraft swaps were complicated procedures that typically added 3 to 4 hours to travel time, assuming alternative aircraft were available, and they were usually implemented only when safety concerns made it impossible to proceed with the original equipment. Beverly Chen, who was standing in the first-class galley trying to maintain her composure while dealing with a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her ability to control or understand, began to realize that her decision to accommodate Harrison Remington's demands might have triggered consequences that extended far beyond the passenger complaint she'd been trying to avoid. Sandra Beverly called to the flight attendant who'd been documenting the seating dispute, her voice carrying the kind of desperation that came from someone who was beginning to understand that she might have made a career-ending mistake. "Do you have any idea why the computer systems would be malfunctioning right after we completed boarding? Is there anything unusual that you observed during the passenger loading process that might have triggered some kind of security alert?" Sandra looked at Beverly with the kind of measured attention that came from someone who was being asked to choose between supporting a colleague's bad decision and accurately reporting what had actually occurred. "The only unusual thing that happened during boarding was your decision to move 2 passengers from their confirmed first-class seats to economy without proper authorization or documentation. If the aircraft systems are flagging security irregularities, that would be the most likely cause. The observation hung in the air between them like an accusation that Beverly couldn't refute without admitting that she had made her seating decisions for reasons that couldn't withstand professional scrutiny. But Beverly had gone too far to acknowledge error at this point, and admitting that her unauthorized passenger relocations might have triggered the technical crisis would mean accepting responsibility for stranding 300 passengers and potentially costing the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars in delay compensation and missed connections. Those passengers were moved according to standard customer accommodation protocols. Beverly insisted, though her voice lacked the conviction that had carried her through earlier stages of this confrontation. There's no reason their seating change would affect aircraft systems or departure authorization. But even as Beverly spoke, she was beginning to understand that she might be dealing with forces that operated according to rules she didn't understand and couldn't control through the customer service tactics that had served her throughout her 15-year career. In row 38, Kai Washington checked his phone and confirmed that the aircraft systems would remain locked until someone with administrative authority contacted TechFlow Dynamics to request emergency override codes that would allow departure to proceed. The beautiful irony of the situation was that the airline's own technical support department was about to call Kai and Zane Washington to ask for help resolving the crisis that Beverly Chen had created by discriminating against them. The phone call that would change everything came 43 minutes after the scheduled departure time, when Horizon Air's technical support supervisor finally admitted that their own systems engineers couldn't resolve the aircraft lockdown and contacted TechFlow Dynamics directly for emergency assistance. The irony that was about to unfold was that the airline's desperate request for help would be answered by the same two passengers who'd been forcibly relocated to economy seats because Beverly Chen had assumed they weren't important enough to matter. Kai Washington's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he recognized immediately. Horizon Air's corporate headquarters in Seattle, where their 24-hour technical support center was located. He looked at Zane, who was watching the growing agitation among passengers as the delay stretched toward the 1-hour mark that would trigger federal compensation requirements for everyone on board. "It's them," Kai said, simply showing his brother the caller ID display. "Are you going to answer it?" Zane asked. "Oh, absolutely." Kai replied, his voice carrying the quiet anticipation of someone who was about to enjoy a conversation that would demonstrate exactly how badly the other party had miscalculated their relative positions of power. "But I think I'm going to put it on speaker so our fellow passengers can understand what's happening here." Kai accepted the call and immediately activated the speaker function, holding the phone at a volume level that would carry clearly throughout the economy section, where frustrated travelers were beginning to demand explanations for a delay that had now lasted longer than some domestic flights. TechFlow Dynamics. "This is Kai Washington speaking, Mr. Washington. This is David Hawthorne, Chief Technology Officer for Horizon Air. I'm calling because we have an emergency situation with Flight 415 at JFK, and our systems engineers can't resolve the lockdown that's preventing departure. We need immediate assistance with override codes to get this aircraft moving, or we're looking at a complete passenger transfer that could cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars." The name David Hawthorne sent a ripple of recognition through the passengers who were close enough to hear the conversation clearly. Hawthorne wasn't just Horizon Air's technology chief. He was the executive who'd negotiated TechFlow's original logistics contract and served as the primary liaison between the airline's operations and the software systems that kept their flights running on schedule. More importantly, he was someone who definitely knew who Kai and Zane Washington were and what kind of influence they wielded over the technology that Horizon Air depended on for their basic operations. David Kai said, his voice taking on the friendly but professional tone he used when conducting business with corporate executives who understood the value of maintaining good relationships with their most important vendors. "It's good to hear from you, though. I have to say the circumstances are a little unusual. I'm actually sitting on Flight 415 right now in row 38, having been forcibly moved here from my confirmed first-class seat because your gate agent decided that I don't look like I belong in first class." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete and prolonged that several passengers began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When Hawthorne finally spoke again, his voice carried the kind of barely controlled panic that came from realizing that a routine technical support request had just revealed a public relations catastrophe that could destroy careers and cost the company millions of dollars in legal settlements and lost business. You're on the aircraft." Hawthorne's voice cracked slightly, and passengers throughout the economy cabin could hear the pure horror in his tone as he began to understand the implications of what had happened. "Kai, please tell me you're joking. Please tell me that our gate staff didn't move you and Zane out of first class." "I wish I were joking," David Kai replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm professionalism that made the airline executive's panic even more obvious by contrast. "Your senior gate agent Beverly Chen decided that we needed to be relocated to premium economy to accommodate Harrison Remington, who apparently threw a tantrum when he discovered that his usual seats had been sold to paying customers. When we politely declined to give up the seats we'd purchased, Ms. Chen threatened to have us arrested for disruptive behavior." The economy cabin had gone completely silent as passengers realized they were listening to a conversation between someone who apparently had significant influence over airline operations and a corporate executive who was clearly terrified about the implications of what had occurred. Even the crying baby in row 31 had quieted, as if sensing that the adults around him were processing something important. "Jesus Christ," Hawthorne whispered, apparently forgetting that he was on speakerphone with an audience of 300 passengers who could hear every word. "Kai, I am so sorry. This is completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that we're going to make this right immediately. Can you give me 5 minutes to get Beverly Chen on a conference call so we can resolve this situation?" "Actually, David, I think it would be more efficient if you called Beverly directly and asked her to explain her decision-making process to you while the passengers who witnessed her behavior can hear her responses. She's standing about 30 rows in front of me right now, probably wondering why the aircraft systems are locked and why her supervisors are about to have some very uncomfortable conversations about discrimination and passenger rights." Zane was watching his brother orchestrate this conversation with the kind of admiration that came from seeing someone implement a plan that was both strategically brilliant and emotionally satisfying. Kai wasn't just revealing the power dynamics that Beverly and Harrison had failed to understand. He was doing it in a way that educated everyone on the aircraft about exactly what had happened and why the consequences were about to be both swift and decisive. Mr. Washington came a new voice on the phone, crisp and authoritative, in a way that immediately commanded attention. "This is Patricia Morrison, Chief Executive Officer of Horizon Air. I've just been briefed on this situation, and I want to personally apologize for the completely unacceptable treatment you and your brother have received from our staff." Patricia Morrison's name carried even more weight than David Hawthorne's among the passengers who followed business news or aviation industry developments. As CEO, she was ultimately responsible for every aspect of Horizon Air's operations, and her direct involvement in this conversation suggested that the airline's corporate leadership understood they were dealing with a crisis that could have implications far beyond the immediate technical problems. Miss Morrison Kai replied, "I appreciate you taking the time to address this situation personally, but I think it's important for you to understand that this isn't just about my brother and me. Your gate agent made her decision based on assumptions about what successful passengers look like, and those assumptions led her to violate both your company's policies and federal regulations regarding passenger treatment. The question is what you're going to do to ensure that this kind of discrimination doesn't happen to other passengers who might not have the resources to protect themselves." "You're absolutely right," Morrison replied without hesitation. "And I want you to know that we're going to conduct a complete investigation of this incident and implement whatever changes are necessary to prevent it from happening again. But right now, my immediate concern is getting you and your brother back to your proper seats and ensuring that the staff responsible for this situation understand that their behavior is completely unacceptable." Emma Rodriguez, who had been listening to this conversation with the kind of intense attention that children brought to situations that confirmed their understanding of right and wrong, suddenly stood up in her row 3 seat and spoke directly toward Kai's phone. "Mr. Washington," she said, her young voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "I'm Emma, the little girl who talked to you earlier. I wrote down everything that happened in my notebook, including the mean things that man said about your clothes and how the lady with the badge threatened to call the police on you for sitting in your own seats. My dad says that when people do wrong things, good people should make sure there are consequences, so it doesn't happen to other people." The comment from an 8-year-old passenger who had apparently documented the entire incident sent another ripple of shock through both the cabin and the corporate executives on the phone. Children's observations carried particular weight in discrimination cases because they hadn't yet learned to rationalize or excuse behavior that violated basic principles of fairness and respect. "Thank you," Emma Kai said warmly. "Your father sounds like a very wise man, and you sound like a very brave young lady for paying attention and speaking up when you saw something that wasn't right." "Ms. Morrison," came Beverly Chen's voice, apparently having been patched into the conference call that was now being conducted in front of 300 witnesses. "I can explain the seating situation. We had a valued customer with specific accommodation needs, and I made a standard customer service decision to ensure that all passengers were comfortable with their arrangements." Ms. Chen Morrison's voice cut through Beverly's explanation with surgical precision. "Did you or did you not move 2 confirmed first-class passengers to economy seats without their consent and without proper authorization? I made a judgment call based on customer service priorities," Beverly replied, her voice already carrying the sound of someone who knew her explanations weren't going to save her position. "That's not what I asked," Morrison continued. "I asked whether you moved confirmed passengers from their purchased seats to accommodate another passenger's demands." "Yes or no?" The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Beverly finally answered. "Yes." "And did you threaten to have those passengers arrested when they objected to being moved?" Another pause. "I informed them that failure to comply with crew instructions could result in security intervention. For trying to sit in seats they had legally purchased and confirmed yes." Patricia Morrison's next words were delivered with the kind of cold finality that everyone on the aircraft recognized as a career-ending pronouncement. "Ms. Chen, you are terminated effective immediately. Please gather your personal belongings and leave the aircraft. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will receive information about your final paycheck and benefits through our Human Resources Department. Your actions today violated federal regulations, company policy, and basic standards of human decency, and they have created legal liability for this airline that will take years to resolve." The termination announcement sent shockwaves through the cabin as passengers realized they had just witnessed the real-time consequences of discrimination in an industry where customer service decisions could make or break careers in a matter of minutes. But Beverly Chen's firing was just the beginning of the consequences that would flow from her decision to judge 2 passengers by their appearance rather than their credentials. The aftermath of Beverly Chen's termination unfolded with the swift brutality that characterized corporate damage control in the social media age, where viral incidents could destroy brands and careers faster than traditional public relations strategies could contain them. Within 30 minutes of Patricia Morrison's announcement, the hashtags #Seatgate and #FlyingWhileBlack were trending on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, driven by passenger videos that captured everything from Beverly's discriminatory treatment of the Washington brothers to their dignified response when they revealed their true identity to airline executives who had no idea who they were dealing with. Emma Rodriguez had become an unlikely hero of the viral moment, with her innocent observations about fairness and justice being quoted in social media posts that were being shared thousands of times per hour. Her 8-year-old declaration that clothes don't make people good or bad and how you treat other people is what makes you good or bad was being retweeted by celebrities, politicians, and civil rights organizations as a perfect encapsulation of the moral issues at stake when discrimination masqueraded as customer service. But the social media storm was just the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond Beverly's individual termination. Within hours of the incident, investigative journalists were examining Horizon Air's passenger complaint records, discovering patterns of discriminatory treatment that suggested Beverly's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger cultural problem that the airline had failed to address through training oversight or accountability measures. The legal implications were even more serious than the public relations disaster. Federal aviation regulations included specific provisions prohibiting discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or other protected characteristics, and violating those regulations could result in fines, license suspensions, and criminal charges for individual employees, as well as corporate penalties that could reach into the millions of dollars. More importantly, the Washington brothers had the financial resources to pursue civil rights litigation that could establish legal precedents affecting the entire aviation industry. Harrison Remington III, whose tantrum had initiated the chain of events that led to Beverly's termination and Horizon Air's public humiliation, was experiencing his own reckoning as business associates and family members began calling to express their horror at his behavior and distance themselves from the racial entitlement that had been captured on video and shared across global social media platforms. Remington Steele's board of directors was already scheduling emergency meetings to discuss Harrison's continued employment with the company as their stock price began declining in response to investor concerns about being associated with executive leadership that displayed overt racial prejudice in public settings. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the incident was the conversation it had sparked about power dynamics in service industries where workers were trained to prioritize customer satisfaction over passenger rights, creating environments where discrimination could flourish under the cover of business policies that prioritized some customers over others based on assumptions about their value to the company's bottom line. The Washington brothers, who had chosen to transform their humiliation into an opportunity for education, rather than simply pursuing revenge through litigation, were already discussing with Patricia Morrison how Horizon Air could implement changes that would prevent future incidents while creating accountability systems that would protect both passengers and employees from the kind of arbitrary decision-making that had characterized Beverly's behavior. What we want, Kai had explained to Morrison during a follow-up call that was conducted privately, rather than in front of the aircraft's passengers, is a commitment from your airline to implement blind booking protocols that prevent gate agents from making seating decisions based on passenger appearance, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, and transparent complaint procedures that allow passengers to appeal discriminatory treatment through independent review processes. Morrison had agreed immediately, recognizing that implementing those changes proactively would be far less expensive than defending against the civil rights litigation that would inevitably follow if Horizon Air didn't demonstrate genuine commitment to addressing the systemic issues that had enabled Beverly's discrimination. More importantly, Morrison understood that the Washington brothers' reputation in the tech industry meant that their endorsement or condemnation of Horizon Air's response could influence other high-value business travelers who represented millions of dollars in annual revenue. The broader aviation industry was also beginning to grapple with implications that extended beyond Horizon Air's immediate crisis. Airlines across the country were reviewing their customer service training programs, passenger accommodation policies, and discrimination complaint procedures, recognizing that the viral nature of the incident had created public awareness about discriminatory practices that had previously been handled quietly through private settlements and non-disclosure agreements that prevented patterns from being recognized or addressed. Civil rights organizations were using the incident to highlight broader issues of discrimination in transportation, hospitality, and other service industries where workers wielded arbitrary power over customers' access to accommodations they had legally purchased. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People announced that they would be conducting a comprehensive study of airline passenger treatment patterns, with particular focus on whether discriminatory policies were being implemented under the cover of customer service protocols that gave employees discretionary authority over passenger accommodations. Emma Rodriguez, whose moral clarity had provided a child's perspective on adult failures of justice and courage, was receiving interview requests from national media outlets that wanted to feature her observations about fairness and discrimination. Her father, Miguel Rodriguez, was carefully managing his daughter's sudden fame while using the platform to educate the public about the everyday discrimination that service workers often witnessed, but were discouraged from challenging due to employment pressures and hierarchical structures that punished whistleblowing more harshly than misconduct. The technical aspects of the incident were also attracting attention from industry analysts who were beginning to understand that TechFlow Dynamics had built anti-discrimination protocols into their logistics software that could prevent the kind of arbitrary passenger treatment that had characterized Beverly's behavior. The possibility that airlines could implement technological solutions to discriminatory practices was creating interest from both civil rights advocates and corporate executives who recognized that automated systems might be more effective than training programs in ensuring consistent application of anti-discrimination policies. Meanwhile, Beverly Chen was experiencing the personal devastation that comes from having 15 years of professional experience destroyed by a single decision that revealed character flaws she'd never been forced to confront. Within hours of her termination, her story was being covered by national news outlets that identified her by name and included details about her employment history that made it clear she would never work in the aviation industry again. The professional network she'd built over 15 years was evaporating as colleagues and industry contacts distanced themselves from someone whose name had become synonymous with workplace discrimination. But Beverly was also beginning to experience something that she'd never encountered during her years of serving affluent white customers, who'd reinforced her assumptions about who deserved respect and accommodation. She was being forced to confront the reality that her decision-making had been driven by racial prejudices that she'd disguised as customer service protocols even to herself. For the first time in her adult life, she was having to examine whether her professional success had been built on her willingness to accommodate discrimination rather than challenge it. The psychological reckoning was perhaps more difficult than the professional consequences because it required Beverly to acknowledge that she'd spent years treating passengers differently based on their appearance while convincing herself that she was simply being practical about customer service priorities. The cognitive dissonance between her self-image as a professional service provider and the reality of her discriminatory behavior was creating the kind of internal crisis that could either lead to genuine personal growth or deeper denial and resentment. Harrison Remington was facing a similar psychological reckoning, complicated by the fact that his discriminatory attitudes had been shaped by generations of family wealth and social privilege that had insulated him from ever having to consider the perspectives of people who didn't share his advantages. The viral nature of his behavior had stripped away the social protections that had previously allowed him to express racial prejudices without facing meaningful consequences, forcing him to confront the possibility that his sense of entitlement wasn't shared by the broader public that was now judging his character through social media commentary and news coverage. The incident was also having implications for Vivian Remington, whose silent complicity in her husband's behavior had been captured on video and was being analyzed by social media commenters who were questioning how supposed allies of racial equality could witness discrimination and choose to remain silent rather than speaking up for victims of prejudice. The pressure was creating tensions in their marriage that had been building for years as Harrison's behavior became increasingly difficult to rationalize or ignore. As Flight 415 finally received clearance for departure with Kai and Zane, Washington restored to their original first-class seats, and Harrison Remington relocated to premium economy as consequences for his role in initiating the discriminatory incident. Passengers throughout the aircraft were processing their own roles as witnesses to discrimination, and considering how they might respond differently if they encountered similar situations in the future. Emma Rodriguez, who was carefully documenting the resolution of the incident in her pink notebook, had learned lessons about justice, courage, and moral responsibility that would influence her character development for the rest of her life. Her father's teaching about speaking up when witnessing unfairness had been validated by seeing real consequences follow from her willingness to document and challenge discriminatory behavior, even when the adults around her were choosing silence over confrontation. The transformation that was beginning on Flight 415 would extend far beyond the immediate participants, creating ripple effects throughout an industry that was being forced to confront systemic issues it had previously been able to ignore or minimize through private settlements and policy changes that addressed symptoms rather than causes of discriminatory treatment. 6 months after the incident that would forever be known in aviation industry circles as the Flight 415. Awakening. The changes that had begun with Kai and Zane. Washington's dignified response to discrimination had transformed not just Horizon Air's operations, but the broader airline industry's approach to passenger rights and employee accountability. The viral nature of the incident had created sustained public pressure for meaningful reform rather than cosmetic policy changes, and the Washington brothers had used their platform to ensure that the momentum for change translated into concrete improvements that would benefit future travelers. Horizon Air's transformation had been swift and comprehensive, driven both by Patricia Morrison's recognition that genuine change was necessary and by the Washington brothers' willingness to work collaboratively with the airline rather than simply pursuing maximum financial damages through litigation. The Dignity First protocols that had been implemented across all Horizon Air operations included blind booking systems that prevented gate agents from seeing passenger names or photos until the moment of seat scanning, eliminating the opportunity for discriminatory prejudgments based on appearance or assumptions about passenger backgrounds. The bias training program that every Horizon Air employee was required to complete wasn't the superficial diversity workshop that characterized most corporate anti-discrimination efforts, but a comprehensive educational experience that included real scenarios, documented case studies, and ongoing assessment protocols that measured behavioral changes rather than just completion certificates. Employees were required to demonstrate their understanding of passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies through practical simulations that tested their ability to handle challenging situations without resorting to prejudicial assumptions or arbitrary authority. Perhaps most significantly, Horizon Air had implemented independent oversight mechanisms that allowed passengers to appeal discriminatory treatment through review processes that operated outside the airline's normal customer service hierarchy, ensuring that complaints about employee behavior couldn't be dismissed or minimized by supervisors who were more concerned with protecting staff than addressing legitimate grievances about civil rights violations. The technological solutions that TechFlow Dynamics had developed for preventing discriminatory passenger treatment had been adopted by 12 major airlines within 4 months of the Flight 415 incident, creating industry-wide standards for passenger accommodation protocols that prioritized documented policies over employee discretion. The software innovations that Kai and Zane had originally designed to improve logistics efficiency had evolved into comprehensive civil rights protection systems that made discrimination both more difficult to implement and easier to detect through automated monitoring and reporting protocols. Emma Rodriguez had become an unexpected spokesperson for the next generation's expectations about equality and justice, with her observations about fairness and moral courage being featured in educational materials that were being used in schools across the country to teach children about civil rights history and contemporary social justice issues. Her father, Miguel, had been promoted to a supervisory position with the Port Authority, where he was helping to implement employee training programs that emphasized the importance of speaking up when witnessing discriminatory treatment, rather than remaining silent to avoid potential employment complications. The legal precedents established through the Washington brothers' strategic approach to civil rights litigation had created new standards for accountability in service industries, with federal courts recognizing that discriminatory treatment of customers constituted a form of civil rights violation that could result in significant financial penalties for companies that failed to implement adequate prevention and response systems. The decisions had been particularly important because they established that discrimination based on appearance or assumptions about customer value violated federal regulations even when it was implemented through customer service policies, rather than explicit racial targeting. Beverly Chen's personal journey following her termination had been more complex and difficult than the immediate consequences suggested. The public nature of her humiliation had initially driven her toward resentment and denial as she struggled to reconcile her self-image as a professional service provider with the reality that her behavior had been characterized by national media as overtly discriminatory. But the complete destruction of her professional network and the impossibility of finding employment in her chosen field had eventually forced her to confront the prejudicial assumptions that had guided her decision-making throughout her 15-year career. The turning point in Beverly's psychological transformation had come during a mandatory community service program that had connected her with civil rights organizations that were working to address discrimination in service industries. For the first time in her adult life, she'd been required to listen to detailed accounts of how discriminatory treatment affected victims emotionally, financially, and socially, and to understand that her behavior on Flight 415 hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of microaggressions that created cumulative trauma for people who faced prejudice regularly. Beverly's work with civil rights organizations had gradually evolved from court-mandated service into genuine advocacy as she began speaking to customer service workers about recognizing and interrupting their own unconscious biases before they resulted in discriminatory treatment of customers. Her presentations were particularly powerful because she could describe the decision-making process that had led to her discriminatory behavior, helping other employees understand how prejudicial assumptions could masquerade as customer service policies even to the people implementing them. The redemption that Beverly was working toward would never fully compensate for the harm she'd caused to the Washington brothers and other passengers who'd been subjected to her discriminatory treatment over the years. But her transformation into an advocate for civil rights awareness was creating educational value that helped prevent other service workers from making similar mistakes. Her story had become a case study in how discrimination could be unconscious and systematic rather than intentional and overt, and how professional environments could enable prejudicial behavior through policies that prioritized customer satisfaction over passenger rights. Harrison Remington's personal reckoning had been even more devastating than Beverly's because his discriminatory attitudes had been shaped by generations of inherited privilege that had insulated him from ever having to consider perspectives that challenged his assumptions about social hierarchy and racial entitlement. The board of directors of Remington Steel had terminated his employment within a week of the viral incident, recognizing that his association with the company created liability risks that extended far beyond the immediate public relations disaster. The financial consequences of Harrison's behavior had been compounded by divorce proceedings initiated by Vivian, who had finally found the courage to challenge her husband's character after witnessing public condemnation that validated her private concerns about his treatment of people he considered socially inferior. The prenuptial agreement that Harrison had insisted upon to protect his family's wealth had included morality clauses that allowed Vivian to claim substantial assets if Harrison's behavior brought public disgrace to the family name. But, perhaps more significantly, Harrison had been forced to confront the reality that his sense of racial superiority had been based on inherited advantages rather than personal accomplishments, and that his assumptions about social hierarchy weren't shared by the broader society that was now judging his character through social media commentary and news coverage. The psychological adjustment required accepting that wealth and family name didn't grant automatic respect or deference from people who evaluated character based on behavior rather than background. Harrison's attempts at redemption had been more limited and less successful than Beverly's, partly because his transformation required dismantling decades of entitlement and privilege that had shaped his fundamental worldview. His court-mandated community service had connected him with organizations that worked with homeless populations and low-income families, forcing him to interact with people he'd previously dismissed as irrelevant to his social circle or business interests. The experience had been humbling in ways that Harrison had never anticipated, as he discovered that many of the people he'd assumed were failures or degenerates were actually individuals who'd faced systematic barriers and discrimination that had limited their opportunities for economic advancement. The realization that social outcomes were influenced by structural inequalities rather than just personal choices had challenged Harrison's meritocratic assumptions and forced him to question whether his own success had been earned through individual effort or inherited through advantages that weren't available to everyone. The broader cultural impact of the Flight 415 incident had extended beyond the aviation industry to influence discussions about discrimination in hospitality, retail, and other service sectors, where workers wielded arbitrary authority over customer access to accommodations and services. The viral nature of the incident had created public awareness about how discrimination could be implemented through customer service policies that appeared neutral but were applied selectively based on employee assumptions about customer value or social status. Corporate training programs across multiple industries had been revised to emphasize that treating all customers with equal respect wasn't just a matter of good business practice, but a legal requirement that could result in significant financial and reputational consequences for companies that failed to maintain adequate anti-discrimination systems. The legal precedents established through the Washington brothers' strategic approach to civil rights advocacy had created new standards for accountability that made it clear that discriminatory customer service constituted a form of civil rights violation rather than just poor business practice. The educational impact had been particularly significant in business schools and customer service training programs, where the Flight 415 case study was being used to teach future managers about the intersection of civil rights law, customer relations, and corporate liability. Students were required to analyze how seemingly routine customer service decisions could violate federal regulations and create legal exposure that extended far beyond the immediate incident, and to develop protocols for ensuring that customer accommodation policies didn't enable discriminatory treatment of passengers based on appearance, race, or other protected characteristics. Emma Rodriguez, who was now 9 years old and still in regular contact with the Washington brothers through a mentorship program they'd established for young advocates of social justice, had continued to demonstrate the kind of moral clarity that had made her observations so powerful during the original incident. Her notebook documentation of discriminatory behavior had become a teaching tool for other children about the importance of witnessing and reporting unfair treatment, and her simple declarations about fairness and respect had been quoted in academic papers about child psychology and moral development. The long-term implications of the Flight 415 transformation were still unfolding, but the immediate changes had already prevented dozens of documented cases of discriminatory passenger treatment through early intervention systems that identified problematic behavior before it escalated into civil rights violations. The technological solutions that had been implemented across the aviation industry were being adapted for other service sectors, creating the possibility that discrimination prevention could become a standard feature of customer relations systems, rather than an afterthought that was addressed only after complaints had been filed. Most importantly, the incident had demonstrated that individual courage and strategic advocacy could create institutional changes that benefited thousands of people who would never know the names of the specific individuals who had stood up for justice when it would have been easier to remain silent or accept unfair treatment as the price of avoiding confrontation. 1 year after the incident that had transformed their understanding of power privilege and moral courage, Kai and Zane Washington stood in the same JFK Terminal 4 lounge where their journey had begun. But everything about the space had changed in ways that reflected the broader transformation their experience had catalyzed throughout the aviation industry. The exclusive area that had once been reserved for first-class passengers and elite frequent flyers had been redesigned as an inclusive space that welcomed travelers regardless of their ticket class or economic status, embodying the principle that dignity and respect shouldn't be luxury amenities available only to those who could afford premium accommodations. The Ruby Washington Memorial Lounge, renamed in honor of the grandmother whose wisdom had guided the brothers' response to discrimination, featured photographs and quotations from civil rights pioneers whose courage had created opportunities for future generations to live with greater freedom and equality. The walls displayed portraits of Rosa Parks Thurgood Marshall, Dorothy Height, and other leaders whose strategic resistance to injustice had established legal and social precedents that made contemporary civil rights advocacy possible, alongside contemporary images of ordinary people who had chosen courage over comfort when confronted with opportunities to challenge unfair treatment. Emma Rodriguez, now 9 years old and carrying the same pink notebook that had documented the original discrimination incident, was accompanying the Washington brothers on a ceremonial flight to London that would mark the first anniversary of their transformative experience, while celebrating the changes that their dignified resistance had made possible for travelers throughout the aviation industry. Her father, Miguel, had been promoted to a senior supervisory position with the Port Authority, where his expertise in recognizing and preventing discriminatory treatment had made him a valuable resource for implementing employee training programs that prioritized passenger rights over arbitrary customer service policies. The aircraft that would carry them to London was operated by Skybridge Airlines, the new company that Kai and Zane had established after acquiring Horizon Air's international routes and implementing comprehensive reforms that had made their carrier the industry standard for equality and passenger dignity. The acquisition hadn't been motivated by revenge against the airline that had originally discriminated against them, but by their recognition that creating positive change required building systems that prevented discrimination rather than simply punishing it after it occurred. Skybridge's innovative approach to passenger services had eliminated the artificial hierarchies that traditionally characterized airline operations, implementing policies that ensured every traveler received respectful treatment regardless of their ticket price or perceived social status. The Dignity First protocols that governed every aspect of Skybridge's operations had been adopted voluntarily by 17 other carriers within 12 months, creating industry-wide standards that prioritized passenger rights over employee convenience or customer service expedience. The technological solutions that TechFlow Dynamics had developed for preventing discriminatory treatment had evolved into comprehensive civil rights protection systems that were being implemented across multiple service industries, creating automated monitoring and reporting capabilities that made discrimination both easier to detect and more difficult to rationalize through claims of customer service necessity or operational efficiency. The software innovations had received recognition from the United Nations Human Rights Council as examples of how technology could be leveraged to promote equality and prevent systematic exclusion in commercial environments. As they prepared to board the anniversary flight, the Washington brothers reflected on the journey that had begun with humiliation and evolved into an opportunity to create lasting change that would benefit travelers they would never meet, but whose experiences would be improved by the systems and standards they'd helped establish. The transformation hadn't been without personal costs. The public attention that followed their viral experience had required them to become advocates and educators. In addition to technology, entrepreneurs adding responsibilities they hadn't anticipated when they'd simply wanted to fly to London for a business meeting. But the advocacy work had also connected them with a community of civil rights activists, policy reformers, and social justice advocates who shared their commitment to creating institutional changes that would make equality a practical reality, rather than just an aspirational goal. The relationships they'd built with organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the American Civil Liberties Union had expanded their understanding of how technology could be used to address systematic barriers and create accountability mechanisms that would protect vulnerable populations from discriminatory treatment. Emma Rodriguez had continued to serve as their moral compass and inspiration, reminding them through her observations and questions that the ultimate measure of their success wasn't the financial value of their business enterprises, but the impact their work had on creating a more just and inclusive society. Her presence on the anniversary flight represented continuity between the child who had first spoken up about unfair treatment and the young advocate who was already demonstrating leadership potential that suggested she would continue challenging injustice throughout her life. The memorial flight to London would also carry Beverly Chen, whose transformation from discriminatory gate agent to civil rights educator had become one of the most powerful examples of how individuals could acknowledge their mistakes, accept responsibility for harmful behavior, and commit themselves to creating positive change that would prevent others from experiencing similar treatment. Beverly's redemption journey had been neither quick nor easy, requiring her to confront psychological biases and professional assumptions that had shaped her worldview for decades, but her willingness to become an advocate for anti-discrimination training had created educational value that was helping other service workers recognize and interrupt their own prejudicial assumptions. Harrison Remington's transformation had been more limited and less successful, reflecting the greater difficulty of dismantling privilege and entitlement that had been reinforced by generations of inherited advantage and social position. His court-mandated community service had connected him with homeless advocacy organizations and low-income assistance programs that had challenged his assumptions about poverty and social mobility. But his progress toward genuine understanding remained incomplete and fragile, dependent on continued external pressure rather than internalized commitment to equality and justice. The broader cultural impact of their experience had extended far beyond the aviation industry to influence how Americans thought about discrimination, accountability, and the responsibility that individuals had to challenge unfair treatment when they witnessed it occurring around them. The viral nature of the original incident had created sustained public conversation about how discrimination operated in contemporary society, moving beyond abstract discussions of prejudice to concrete examples of how bias influenced everyday decisions about who deserved respect and accommodation. Educational institutions had incorporated the Flight 415 case study into curricula that taught students about civil rights history, business ethics, and moral courage, using the incident to illustrate how individual choices about challenging or accepting injustice could create ripple effects that influenced institutional policies and cultural norms. The story had become particularly valuable for teaching young people about the importance of speaking up when witnessing unfair treatment, demonstrating that moral courage didn't require extraordinary heroism, but simply the willingness to document truth and resist the social pressure to remain silent when confronted with discrimination. As their anniversary flight prepared for departure, Kai and Zane Washington understood that their experience had taught them something their grandmother Ruby had always known, but that they'd had to learn through direct confrontation with prejudice, that dignity wasn't something other people could grant or deny them, but something they carried within themselves, regardless of how others chose to treat them. The discrimination they'd faced had been painful and humiliating, but their response had demonstrated that victims of injustice could choose to transform their experience into opportunities for creating systemic changes that would benefit people they would never meet. Emma Rodriguez, who was carefully documenting the anniversary journey in her notebook, while preparing to interview other passengers about their experiences with airline travel and customer service, had learned lessons about justice and moral courage that would influence her character development for the rest of her life. Her questions about fairness and respect had helped adults understand that children often possessed clearer moral vision than people who'd learned to rationalize discrimination through claims of practicality or business necessity. The flight to London would carry more than just passengers commemorating the anniversary of a viral incident. It would transport a group of individuals who had learned through direct experience that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort and justice over convenience. The transformation that had begun with two men in hoodies being denied their purchased airline seats had evolved into a movement that was changing how service industries approached civil rights compliance, and how individuals understood their responsibility to challenge discrimination when they encountered it in their daily lives. As the aircraft lifted off from JFK and climbed toward cruising altitude, Emma Rodriguez looked out her window at the city falling away below them and made a note in her pink notebook. Today, we're flying. To remember how we learned that fairness isn't automatic. It's something good people have to work for every day. The observation captured the essential truth that the Washington brothers had discovered through their transformative experience, that equality and justice weren't destinations that societies reached and maintained automatically, but ongoing processes that required constant attention, courageous advocacy, and the willingness of individuals to challenge unfair treatment whenever and wherever they encountered it. Their flight to London carried them toward a future that had been made more just by their refusal to accept discrimination as inevitable, demonstrating that the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger or revenge, but the strategic creation of systems and standards that would prevent other people from experiencing the same injustice they had faced. 5 years after the incident that transformed airline customer service standards across the industry, the changes that began with Kai and Zane Washington's dignified response to discrimination have created lasting improvements in how service industries approach civil rights compliance and passenger treatment. Skybridge Airlines has maintained its position as the gold standard for equality in aviation with their Dignity First program, now required training for customer service workers across 17 major carriers. Emma Rodriguez, now 13, and participating in her school's debate team while maintaining her friendship with the Washington brothers, continues to demonstrate the moral clarity that made her childhood observations so powerful during the original incident. Beverly Chen leads anti-discrimination workshops at 5 major airlines and 3 hospitality companies, using her personal transformation from prejudiced employee to civil rights advocate as a teaching tool that helps other workers recognize unconscious bias before it results in harmful treatment of customers. Her story has become a standard case study in business ethics programs, illustrating how individual prejudices can create corporate liability and how genuine accountability requires acknowledging mistakes rather than minimizing them. Harrison Remington continues his court-mandated community service, working with housing advocacy organizations and gradually learning to understand privilege and entitlement as barriers to empathy rather than markers of personal achievement. The Washington brothers stand together in the Ruby Washington Memorial Lounge at JFK, watching diverse families board planes with dignity intact, knowing their grandmother's lesson about maintaining character, despite others' prejudices, has created institutional changes that will protect travelers for generations to come. The technological solutions they developed have been implemented across multiple service industries, creating automated systems that prevent discrimination while preserving the human dignity that should characterize all customer interactions. Their success demonstrates that the most effective response to injustice isn't destroying those who perpetrate it, but building systems that prevent it from happening to others who might not have the resources to protect themselves. The lesson that Emma Rodriguez learned and continues to teach through her advocacy is that true power isn't in making people pay for their mistakes, but in ensuring those mistakes never happen again. The Flight 415 incident proved that ordinary individuals can create extraordinary change when they choose moral courage over personal comfort, transforming moments of discrimination into opportunities for justice that benefit entire communities and future generations of travelers who will never know the names of those who stood up for equality when it mattered most. If you enjoyed this story of courage, justice, and transformation, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of people who chose to stand up for what's right. We upload new stories every week that remind us all that ordinary individuals can create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable.